the African National Congress, you had the Indian National Congress, Gandhi's, you had the Colored People's Congress, and you had the Congress of Democrats. But the interesting thing is that all of them organized only their own particular race. They accepted as natural the political architecture of apartheid. And that was true until the 1970s. It's only in the 1970s that Steve Biko comes with black consciousness, and he says, black is not a color. Black is an experience. If you are oppressed, you are black. And Steve Biko breaks down the racial walls between Indians, coloreds, Africans, and creates a student movement that now overturns the apartheid architecture. And it is in the 70s that you begin a process which ends in the 1990s. So, to return to Naipaul, Naipaul could critique with a razor's edge, but Naipaul could not provide you with the glimpse of an alternative world. The real challenge is not simply to critique, is to arrive at an alternative. That's my view of Naipaul.
Well, apropos of that, I found it very interesting that you said that black is not a color, as it was related to you, it's an experience, much in the way in which white is not a color, it is a privilege. And then it's, of course, the rest of us, who are just people of color. But I leave that aside for the moment, because as you know, there is a very interesting politics of what we might describe the people of color. Let me move on to the subject of your most recent book, which is called Neither Settler Nor Native, The Making and Unmaking of Permanent Minorities. I'd like you to explain what the subject matter of the book is. But in explaining that, I also wonder if you might be able to comment on something that has struck me in my study of history, which is that I think that the concept of majority and minority, both, are a form of modern political arithmetic, which is to say that I think for centuries, over nearly every part of the world, people seldom thought of themselves as majorities or minorities. I wonder whether the Jews in India, a very small number, and what is very distinctive about the Jews of India is that it is one country where every scholar of world Judaism admits there has never been any instance of anti-Semitism in the history of Jews in India. Now, the Jews never thought of themselves, it seems to me, as a minority, at least in India. Now, they may have thought of themselves as that in the Ottoman Empire in various ways, but nonetheless, I'm saying in totality, it seems to me that this concept of majority and minority is a certain way of thinking which really derives from a kind of political modernity. So I wonder if that might have been, whether you, number one, you would agree with that, and whether that has in any way informed the subject matter of your book.
Well, you're right that majority, minority are not, in a political sense, they are not trans-historical. They are modern terms. But by modern, I do not mean contemporary terms. For me, modernity begins in 1492. It begins with the establishment of the Castilian Empire in Spain. It begins with the claim of one country, one religion, one people, and the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from Spain. The Jews expelled from Spain are welcomed into the Ottoman Empire. If you look at the Jewish experience globally, the Jewish experience in Europe is very different from the Jewish experience in Middle East or in Asia. In Middle East and Asia, the Jews were part of society. You take the example of the Middle Eastern Jews who came into Israel, known as the Mizrahim. The Mizrahim wrote in Arabic, spoke Arabic, their language was Arabic, their culture was Arabic, their religion was Jewish. When they first came in, the Ashkenazi leaders in Israel looked at them and said, "What is this savage rabble?" And one of the biggest social projects in Israel was to de-Arabize the Mizrahim. Right? And the Mizrahim then took possession. They provided the muscle for religious Zionism and the religious Zionist parties which have today taken over Israel. And for the Mizrahim, there were two enemies, Palestinians, but also the Ashkenazi, the European Jews. And that's the fight you are seeing in Israel today. Israel has had a problem it has not been able to solve, which is, who is a Jew? How do you define a Jew? There are still today two definitions of Jew in Israel. One is a broader definition, which is contained in the law of return. The other is an extremely narrow definition in religious law, because personal law, if you are a Jew, your personal law will be Jewish. In halakha law, the Jew is defined very differently from how it is defined by the state. Now, the problem is this, that if Israel is to be a Jewish state, it has had to homogenize the Jews and destroy the diversity of the Jewish experience globally. That is the crisis you are seeing in Israel today.
What you say reminds me of an extraordinary anecdote that I read in a book written by a colleague of yours at Columbia University, Mark Mazover, who wrote a book called Salonika. This is also the city which is known as Thessalonica. And he narrates that during the time of World War II, so Salonika came under Nazi occupation. And when the Nazi commander arrived in Salonika, he asked, "Where is the ghetto?" Because the experience in the rest of Europe, particularly Western Europe, large parts of Eastern Europe as well, was Jews generally lived in ghettos. Germany was actually somewhat of an exception, but they lived in ghettos, particularly Eastern Europe. And he was told, there is no ghetto for the Jews here, because on the same street, you would find an Orthodox church, a Greek Orthodox church, a Syrian Orthodox church, a Protestant church, a mosque. And this Nazi commander writes home to his boss back in Berlin saying, these people are uncivilized. They don't realize that you have to put the Jew in a ghetto. I mean, it's just chilling when you think about it, right? So I'm kind of reminded when you're talking about Israel as well, in a sense, because there is a certain kind of, if I may put it here, I'm doing it metaphorically, a certain kind of ghettoization of Jewish identity.
But I would caution us to exceptionalize the Nazis. What was the Nazi project? The Nazi project was to purify Germany, to rid Germany of all minorities. And the first minority were the Jews, but the Jews were not the only one.
Not the only
there were
one.
also others, right?
Yes.
When the Nazi Party was defeated, and the Americans came in, and the Nuremberg trials were held, there was no questioning the project, the political project of the Nazis. All they did was to start identifying individual Nazis who had committed war crimes, right? Tens of thousands of them, right? But never what was the political project. And they reproduced the Nazi political project in Eastern Europe by throwing out ethnic minorities, and in Germany itself by not reintegrating Jews in Germany, but now supporting the project for a homeland for Jews outside Europe. The Nazi project continues, in my view, right? But the Nazi project, in my view, is also global in this sense. Permanent minorities today exists everywhere the nation state is considered to be a worthy goal.
Yes.
I'll give you an example from India. Although my book is not about India, but since the audience is Indian, I'll give you an example from India. The debate between Gandhi and Ambedkar in the 1930s in Pune. Ambedkar basically made a demand that Dalits should have what Muslims have got, which is special seats, special electorate. Gandhi said no. Why not? Because Gandhi said, Muslims are a minority, Dalits are not a minority. Why not? Because Muslims are not Hindu, but Dalits are Hindu. Ambedkar was not convinced at all. Ambedkar writes in his book that actually he was blackmailed by Gandhi because Gandhi put Ambedkar in a situation that if Gandhi fasted until death, Ambedkar would be held responsible for Gandhi's death. Now, I derived the point that is of interest for me, which is how are minorities defined in India? Minorities are defined as religious groups which are not Hindu, okay? Meaning religion is politicized. There are hundreds of minorities in India, not just religious minorities, all kinds of minorities. But the rest of them are not of significance politically. It's only the religious minority that is of significance. Now, this is not just an Indian thing. You can look at the whole of Asia. You can look at the China, the Uyghurs, Tibetans. You can look at Turkey, the Kurds. You can look at Iran, the Shias. You can look at Pakistan, the Shias, the Ahmadiyas, etc. The whole of Asia has got a minority question which is becoming a burning political question. Here in this conference, I mean, for me, for the last 2 days, it's been an amazing experience to hear and witness the incredible self-confidence, enthusiasm, determination of the economic class in India. When they talk of business, industry, gold, all of these things, right? But the thing is, the economy is not the only thing. We are at a crossroads. It's as if two trains are running and whether they will collide or not, because the other train is the politics. The economy is opening, the politics is closing. That needs a discussion.
Well, you know, the communal pact to which you had referred is a matter of great debate. And I won't really get into that question of the differences between Gandhi and Ambedkar and how to interpret the whole question of minorities with regards to their views. But I just want to see if I might rephrase some of the things you have said in a very simple sentence and see whether you would agree with that, because that might be a way for people to get a grasp on some of the issues that you're tackling. Would it be correct to say that the question that or at least one of the questions that fundamentally animates you is a question of who belongs to the nation state and who doesn't? Would this be the simplest way of characterizing?
Of course.
Yes. All right. So what is the distinction then between immigrants and settlers as you see it? Because that distinction, I think, is important to your book.
So this question has two parts to it.
Yes.
Okay. Of course, who belongs to the nation state and who doesn't is kind of the central question here, right? Because to me, I begin with a commitment to democracy.
Yeah.
Okay. Democracy presumes that majorities and minorities are the result of the democratic process. They don't pre-exist. Before the democratic process, there is no majority and there is no minority politically, right? And therefore, majorities and minorities are temporary. As they move from one political cycle to another, every minority can expect to become a majority tomorrow. And every majority is cautious that if it doesn't deliver, it may become a minority. But with the nation state, you have permanent minorities which pre-exist the democratic process. That's the problem. The nation state compromises the democratic process. Okay. So that's the first part of your question. The second part of your question, sorry, please just remind me.
The second part of the question was, what are the differences
between
immigrants and settlers?
And settler, yeah. Now, immigrants have existed time immemorial. If you go far enough, all our ancestors came from Africa, right? Actually, they came from East Africa, right? And then they spread around the world, right? Those are immigrants. Immigration is in the human DNA. Right? Settler is a very different thing. Settler is a very modern phenomenon. The settler arrives, and the settler is not willing to accept the political arrangement in the community to which he or she has moved. The settler wants to create his and her own state. That's a settler. If you look at the history of Palestine, the first Jewish aliyah which arrives has no ambition to create a state. It becomes part of the society. It moves too. Right? Jews from time immemorial have been natives of Palestine and have immigrated into Palestine. But it's only with the second and the third aliyah that the Zionist immigrants have the ambition to create their own state. Their own state. Israel is Jewish and democratic, not democratic.
Yes.
Democracy only for Jews. There's the problem.
Yes. Right. So it seems that one of the arguments that is intrinsic to this book, and perhaps to much of your work, is a certain argument about the nation state, the problem of the nation state. Historically, we have had many ways to imagine the idea of a political community. It appears, whether one goes back to 1492 or whether one goes back to the Treaty of Westphalia, we won't get into that distinction for the moment, but let's just suppose that the idea of the nation state is 300, 400, 500 years old. Would it be correct to say that the nation state is what has really captured and encapsulated the idea of political modernity, and that the fundamental problem is that the nation state is, in fact, a very impoverished thing, that it is incapable of accommodating the kind of difference that is so critical to human experience?
Let's take the example of America, because I think that expresses the problem at its most acute. On the one hand, America has been a society that has shown amazing capacity to accommodate difference, to take in immigrants. Okay. On the other hand, America lives with an original sin. The original sin is conquest in 1492, which is the conquest of the natives, the American Indians. The American Indians had two kinds of a fate. One was genocide, then there were those who remained. Those who remained, Lincoln devised a solution for them, which was reservations. American Indians in reservations do not enjoy the liberties that citizens in the US do. In 1964, the US passed a Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act did not apply to Indians in reservations. In '68, they passed another act, the Indian Civil Rights Act. But the civil rights in that act could not be enforced. They were advisory. Why? Because even today, the reservations are run by a colonial bureaucracy. They are not, the Indians in the reservations are guardians of US Congress. Okay? So there you are. On the one hand, America, with this amazing capacity to absorb. On the other hand, Indians in the reservations who remain colonized, continuing today. For me, the lesson is this. America has historically two groups of people on which America has been built. One is the Indians, who lost their land, and the other are the Africans, who were enslaved and whose labor built America. Right? But they were in two different political situations. The Africans, now we call them African Americans, were part of a single polity called USA. They were part of a single state. The Indians were part of a two-state system. A sovereign state, USA, and a protectorate, the reservations. And the Indians have remained fragmented. They have remained weak for centuries. The Africans have been able to mobilize, build alliances, even though they are only 15% of the population. Today, they are in the leadership, think of Black Lives Matter. They are in the leadership of political reform. They have provided an agenda for political reform. It's not about numbers. Numbers is not the most important thing.
Right.
It's about the structural context in which these numbers find themselves and the vision with which they put together a future.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Professor Mamdani, for your enlightening views. I've been told that the time is up, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
What an engrossing exchange of ideas to hear. Thank you both very much for that conversation.
Presented by Dabur Vedic Tea, चाय का वही लाजवाब स्वाद अब सेहत के साथ. Co-powered by Dr. Ortho, अब दर्द भी घुटने टेकेगा. Gallant Advanced TMT सरिया निर्माण का रियल हीरो. अब आएगा खाने में असली स्वाद राजेश मसाले के साथ. Driven by Maruti Suzuki. Technology partner, create today, enrich tomorrow, Panasonic. Gold partner, Senco Gold and Diamonds, design of India for you. पार्टनर बीको वज्रदंती, इंडिया का गम एक्सपर्ट, मजेदार नहीं असरदार.